Passed by the CFP. Thank you, Madam Deputy.
Deidre.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Firstly, I'd like to start with just a couple of points that arose from listening to the Secretary of State's speech. Firstly, he claimed that the SNP haven't opposed the CFP and that, in fact, the SNP wanted the UK to remain in the CFP. In fact, way back in 2004, he clearly doesn't recall the 2004 Fisheries Jurisdiction Bill, brought in by then-member Alex Salmond and signed by the Right Honourable Member for Orkney and Shetland, the Right Honourable Member for Belfast North, and some Tory and Labour MPs.
No Tory support for that.
Indeed. And,
well, my honourable, thank you.
Yes, of course.
Just on that point, for the avoidance of doubt, a Fisheries Jurisdiction Bill designed to see the UK leave the CFP in the name of the Right Honourable Gentleman Alex Salmond, and Orkney and Shetland, and Belfast North, and the late Eddie McGrady, and Elvin Clwyd, and Tory and Labour MPs. Does that not rather make a mockery of what the Secretary of State said earlier, and show what a tenuous grasp on reality he has?
Well, it certainly points to some short memories in this place, indeed. And secondly, in March, the Secretary of State said that the government had accepted a suboptimal outcome for fishing in the Brexit negotiations. So I wonder if he could tell us if he still thinks that is so and whether that view is reflected in the bill. I look forward perhaps to that being addressed in the Minister's closing words. Yes.
Full to the Honourable Lady for giving way, because she gave us a history lesson of what a former member of this House did. Would she agree with me that my predecessor as the Member of Parliament for Murray, in the most recent general election campaign, I notice she's getting a whisper from the Honourable Member for Dundee East, but my predecessor in the general election campaign last year, when asked umpteen times on the BBC, would the Scottish National Party agree to go back into the CFP if Scotland became independent and wanted to get back into the EU, he said yes. The party's sole aim is to go back into the CFP.
On our terms, of course, is the point that the Honourable Member is leaving out. And I think if we're looking for a history lesson, let's remind ourselves about the Tories who have been selling out Scottish fishing for nearly half a century. Under Ted Heath in the 1970s, fisheries were considered expendable. In the 1980s, under Margaret Thatcher, the UK government signed us up to the original doomed common fisheries policy, which consigned our fishermen to decades of mismanagement. The John Major's Tories signed up to a revised common fisheries policy in the 1990s, which scrapped vessels and destroyed livelihoods. In the 21st century, the Tories were attempting to enshrine the common fisheries policy in the European treaties, while the SNP was trying to return controls to the fishing nations. And let us not forget, very recently, Ruth Davidson was reported in the Times as calling fisheries a red line issue, and a Scottish Tory source quoted as saying, "We won a lot of votes in the North East on the back of our stance on fishing, and wouldn't be able to show our faces in Banff and Buchan if we renege on this one."
And I'm very grateful to the Honourable Lady for giving way. Does she not agree with me that the Scottish Tory MPs have made 20-gallon galoots of themselves with their resigning, non-resigning nonsense? And I don't know if she knows exactly where they are just now, but are they going to be in or out when all this is concluded?
I'm as baffled as my honourable friend on that particular issue, that is for sure. But perhaps returning to what the points I'm going to make in my speech, I think that the context for this bill has changed somewhat as a result of the withdrawal agreement. Some of the content of that agreement makes some of the apparent intent of the bill a little more difficult to deliver and more dependent upon negotiation and agreement with the 27 remaining members of the EU. Having said that, let me pay tribute to the DEFRA Secretary for staying the course and being determined to see things through to its conclusion. That seems to be a principle or a staying power that's somewhat lacking in his colleagues. Well, erstwhile colleagues, I should say. They may have fallen by the wayside, weary of the march, but he carries on indefatigably. His father, I understand, as he mentioned, was involved in the onshore side of the industry, so he certainly comes at this bill with some knowledge, but with a rather poor recall of facts, if the newspapers are to be believed. So I acknowledge he comes to the table with a backstory, if not a backstop, but that doesn't mean that he necessarily comes with the solutions that the industry needs. The withdrawal agreement that was greeted with such delight on the government benches keeps our fishing industry in the common fisheries policy for a further 2 years after Brexit Day. Although, of course, our lack of membership means that the EU will decide the rules while we have no say in them, no say in how they should be implemented, no voice in the discussions about whether the CFP is meeting its policy objectives.
Well, my honourable friend,
yes.
Well, my honourable friend makes an excellent point, and obviously the SNP have persistently voted against common fisheries policy in the European Parliament, as the records show, as well as this Parliament. And the other point is, has the Secretary of State given her any reassurances around the customs union, which is critical for that excellent produce to get to its markets in the European continent?
Absolutely not. No, my honourable friend makes an excellent point, and indeed hopefully jogs the memory of the Secretary of State a little with that first point. Yes, the honourable gentleman.
Wait, can I just mount a shameless bit of lobbying? The Scottish Government, to tackle illegal lobster potting, has put a limit on recreational lobster fishermen like myself, of 1 lobster landing a day. On the west coast of Scotland, as the honourable gentleman who represents Barrow will know, it's often very difficult to get your boat out more than once every 4 or 5 days. Could she ask the Scottish Government if it could perhaps, instead of putting a limit on 1 lobster a day, look at a limit on the number of pots a recreational fisherman could have, say 5 or 6, and beyond that you would need to get a licence? Thank you.
Thank the honourable gentleman for his intervention. I'm certain the Scottish Government will be following this debate very closely, and they will make a note of his request. Of course, if the steady stream of government ministers heading for the exits delays negotiations on the future relationship between the UK and the EU, then we could find ourselves in an extended period where our fishing industry just complies with the rules rather than having someone in the room standing up for them. Monsieur Barnier has already suggested at least 2 years, and that could well be an underestimate when you consider how long it took to get to the much simpler withdrawal agreement. So we may have to suffer the CFP for quite a few years to come, and it may change to the advantage of the remaining members of the EU and not to ours. We may lose markets to sell fish into, or at the very least find that our competitive advantage has disappeared because we'll be subject to the same tariffs as other non-member states. Well, hopefully the same tariffs. Going by the rather poor negotiation results we've seen so far, we may end up with higher tariffs, reducing the competitive advantage our fleets have traditionally had. Of course, I know it won't come to that because the new fishing deal is already written into the withdrawal agreement by the departing Brexit Secretary. The political declaration tells us that he agreed to a new fisheries agreement with access to UK waters and assigned quota shares being in place in time to be used for determining fishing opportunities for the first year after the transition period. You'll find it on page 5. Now that means that the common fisheries policy will carry on regulating our fishing fleets after we leave the EU. Taking back control has never sounded so hollow. I mean, it's a sad state of affairs for the DEFRA Secretary to have to deliver this news too, because back in March he said he feels a debt to fishing communities who are looking to government to deliver a better deal for them, and he promised that he would ensure our fishermen's interests are properly safeguarded during the implementation period. Well, that period starts on March 29th and lasts an indeterminate amount of time, during which access to some very important markets might be limited. France, for example, is the UK's most important export market for fish, nearly twice as lucrative in cash terms as the US and almost 3 times as strong in export volumes. Spain, by the way, is just behind the US in cash terms and slightly ahead in volume. Ireland, Italy, the Netherlands, Germany, they are all significant customers for our fishing fleets. 2/3 of their fish is exported. A case of EU citizens jumping the queue to buy fish, perhaps. Once the deals are done and we finally leave the CFP, however, we'll still be in the CFP in spite of having left it. It's a conjurer's trick, and it is not a good one. The Secretary of State spoke to leaders of the Danish industry last year and guaranteed them continued access to our waters after Brexit. The UK Embassy in Spain was reassuring Spanish trawlers earlier this year that their access to UK waters was assured. The withdrawal bill replaces common decision-making on the CFP as a member of the EU, with CFP rules handed down from Brussels and no input from ministers from these isles on behalf of the industry here. Well done, those Brexiteers. You certainly did land a whopper there. There is a phrase that is sometimes used by Norwegians to describe their relationship with the EU. They call it a facts democracy, because the rules just come down the line from Brussels. That seems to be what removing ourselves from the EU has done, except, of course, the European Maritime and Fisheries Fund money vanishes, and we have heard nothing about what might replace that in due course. So we'll be left with accepting the rules handed down, and we'll lose access to the decision-making body and the funding from the EU. We'll also have to deal with the consequences of the government's poor negotiation techniques and the uniquely weak position it has left us in. If I may quote the Minister from evidence he gave to a House of Lords committees 26 months ago, we have to recognise historic rights in some sectors. For instance, on scallops, access to the French part of the Channel is quite important for the UK industry. I accept there are trade-offs. All these things will be a matter for negotiation in a new world. Or the Scottish Secretary during the referendum campaign. I think the fishermen are wrong in the sense there is no way we could just go back to Scotland or Britain controlling British waters. There are a whole host of international rules and agreements, even if we were outside the EU, which would impact on their activities. Then, of course, there's the same problem as agriculture has in relation to workforce planning. We'll lose access to the EU workers. That is 58% of Scotland's fish processing workforce, 70% in Grampian, where the Secretary of State's family business was. Scotland's seafood industry and Scotland's fishing industry could be destroyed without access to the EU markets. Scotland's processing industry could be irreversibly damaged without access to EU workers. Now, we've also got to consider Scottish farmed salmon, the UK's most valuable food export, and how losing the market advantage over Norwegian salmon that EU membership gives us could be utterly devastating. Scotland stands to lose a lot without access, and there is little indication of how any of it might be replaced. Yes, of course.
I thank the honourable lady for giving way. It's often quoted from fishermen in the North East that simply there will be more fish consumed within the UK rather than exported. But in my constituency, where the South West Scotland market is, it's nephrops, it's crustaceans, langoustine and lobster, and 85% of them go into the European market. It might well be that we all eat a little bit more white fish after Brexit, but I can't see anybody being in the financial situation that they're going to be eating more lobster.
Indeed, I think the honourable member makes a very good point, and I'm delighted she's brought out the southwest side of the country and their interests in this debate as well. Once more, Scotland's needs are massively different to the needs of England. Once more, we cannot have the Scots industry locked into a rigid framework that will satisfy the English industry. Fishing, of course, has been a devolved matter since 1999, and the responsibility for nearly all of the policy area rests in Edinburgh. And I think the government acknowledges as much with the legislative consent motion that it has asked for at Holyrood. Can I say that while the industry cannot be squeezed into the same box as the English industry, I appreciate the desirability of common frameworks to allow cooperative working on various issues, kind of like the EU managed with the CFP. Where those frameworks are sought and agreed by both sides, they will be mutually beneficial, but they cannot be imposed. They must recognise the devolution settlement and respect it. There must be an element of trust that runs between Whitehall and Holyrood. Her Majesty's government must allow Scotland's government to govern in the devolved areas, and this Parliament must allow Scotland's Parliament to legislate in devolved areas. I think, yes, of course.
Honourable Leader, for giving way. Characteristically divisive speech from the honourable member, as always. And when she's on the subject of division, can she explain how, under the SNP policy, Scotland would be better served when it has to go into a negotiation with England for access to those waters, and how somehow Scotland would get a better result under the SNP policy when it has to negotiate to Europe alone with an even smaller trade and WTO box?
Look at the size of
Madam Deputy Speaker, when Scottish Tories stand up to talk about divisiveness and accuse the SNP of being divisive about anything. Getting back to a more serious subject, I think in general that the provisions in the bill which relate to this area seem to fit those provisions, and while I reserve the right to check that I am correct in thinking that, I welcome the drafting of the bill in this respect. I can't offer the same welcome to some other aspects of the bill, like the setting of quotas. Quotas for Scotland's waters should be set in Scotland, just as quotas for English waters should be set in England and for Welsh waters in Wales. It's devolution. And I'm sure the Minister, or indeed many of his MPs, wouldn't want the Scots and the Welsh setting quotas in Cornwall, so he'll understand why Scots wouldn't want our effort limits set here. And the same applies to foreign vessels in our waters. We know that the Secretary of State has been a little free with his pledges of access to our waters, but it should more appropriately be the devolved administrations that determine such things. The principle upon which devolution was determined, the division of responsibilities and powers, was that anything which was not reserved was devolved. Power does not flow from here to there, but is rather only held here where it is written in the devolution legislation.
They don't believe that.
The matters which were determined on an EU platform but not written into Schedule 5 of the Scotland Act are devolved and should go straight to Holyrood. Will go straight to Holyrood unless there's some power grab, some clawing back of responsibility, some deliberate diminution of Scotland's Parliament. Now, that would be unthinkable, and we should do our level best to ensure that we do not legislate across that boundary. Let us endeavour to ensure that we can modify this bill appropriately to ensure that we do not overcomplicate what should be a simple process. Let us make sure that the responsibilities and powers over our fishing waters and industries rest in the most appropriate places, the devolved administrations for the most part, and this place where there is no